11:19 p.m. Baltic Sea. The research vessel academic Sergei Vavilov, at least that was the name stenciled on its hull in faded Cyrillic, was operating 47 kilometers southwest of the Swedish island of Gotland, on a course that its automatic identification system had logged as a marine biology survey route since departing Kaliningrad 3 days earlier. The AIS transponder was transmitting correctly. The vessel's IMO registration number was valid. Its declared cargo manifest listed oceanographic sampling equipment and laboratory consumables. Every document associated with its transit was properly formatted and had passed automated screening at the Danish Maritime Authority without flag. None of those documents were accurate. The vessel's actual designation within the GRU's Special Operations Directorate was a different classification entirely, a name that appeared in a NATO intelligence database under the category of vessels assessed as capable of undersea infrastructure operations. Its hold contained not oceanographic equipment but a remotely operated vehicle system with a manipulator arm rated to 1,400 meters depth, a precision acoustic positioning system for operating against fixed underwater targets, and 3 technicians from the Russian Navy's GRU Submarine Research Institute who specialized in subsea cable work. The marine biologists listed on the crew manifest had never been aboard. The Gotland Fiber Cable System ran 485 kilometers across the floor of the Baltic Sea, connecting the Swedish mainland to Gotland and continuing to Latvia. A second cable, the FEC Baltica system, connected Estonia to Finland and Sweden in a loop configuration. Together, the 2 systems carried approximately 34% of the military secure data traffic between NATO's northeastern flank member states. Traffic that included encrypted command communications between Finnish and Swedish military headquarters, the sensor fusion data links connecting the Baltic air policing radar architecture, and the dedicated channels that the NATO Multinational Corps Northeast at Stettin used for operational coordination with the new Swedish and Finnish elements integrated following their accession. The cables also carried commercial traffic representing several billion euros in daily financial activity. The military traffic was the target. The commercial disruption would be the message. The GRU operation had been planned for 14 months. Its logic was the same logic that had governed Russian information infrastructure operations for a decade, demonstrating reach without crossing the kinetic threshold that would require a formal military response. Cutting undersea cables in international waters was not an act of war under any established international legal framework. It was a violation of international law, specifically of the 1884 Convention for the Protection of Submarine Telegraph Cables. That carried criminal penalties. Criminal penalties against a state actor operating through a flagged civilian vessel were, in practice, unenforceable. The precedent had been demonstrated in 2021, 2022, and 2023 with incidents in the North Sea and Norwegian Sea that had been attributed to Russian activity with varying degrees of confidence and had produced no kinetic response. The pattern of preceding incidents: the Svalbard cable in late 2021, the Norwegian shelf incidents in 2022, the Baltic approach probes in 2023, had produced an intelligence picture that the GRU's planners had read correctly. Each incident had generated a NATO response at the level of diplomatic protests, intelligence assessments, and policy reviews. None had generated a kinetic response. None had been followed by a change in the legal framework that governed what NATO could do to a flagged civilian vessel in international waters. The GRU assessment was that the pattern would continue. The 1884 Convention's enforcement gap was structural and persistent. A vessel conducting cable operations in international waters could be observed, followed, and protested, but not physically stopped before the cable was severed without generating a legal and diplomatic complication that would benefit Russia more than a severed cable benefited NATO. The assessment had been accurate for 3 years of preceding incidents. What the assessment had not accounted for was the 18 months of work that those preceding incidents had produced within NATO's maritime security architecture. The Cable Protection Response Protocol had been written specifically to close the gap that the 1884 Convention left open, not by changing the law, but by identifying the precise legal threshold at which action became available, maintaining intelligence systems capable of reaching that threshold in the seconds between a vessel's arrival at a cable position and a ROV's first contact with a cable, and pre-positioning response assets and pre-obtaining response authorities so that the window between threshold and action was measured in seconds rather than the hours that conventional command authority processes would have required. The Gotland operation was larger than any of the preceding incidents. 2 cables, not 1. Simultaneous severance at 2 points per cable. A 4-cut package that would produce a recovery timeline measured in weeks rather than days. And the operational timing had been selected to coincide with a period when NATO's Baltic maritime patrol architecture was at its thinnest, the midpoint between scheduled patrol rotations, a known gap in the coverage pattern that GRU Intelligence had established through monitoring of AIS data from NATO patrol vessels over the preceding 8 months. At 11:19:07 p.m., the Vavilov stopped its forward motion and deployed its ROV over the stern. The deployment was visible to one sensor, an RAF Boeing P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating on a routine Baltic surveillance sortie 180 kilometers to the northwest. The P-8A's mission was not cable surveillance. Its synthetic aperture radar, scanning the southwestern Baltic in surface search mode, registered the Vavilov as a stationary vessel of approximately 6,100 tons displacement with a deployment activity consistent with equipment launch over the stern. The P-8A's sensor operator flagged the contact at 11:19:44 a.m., 37 seconds after the ROV entered the water. Because the vessel's AIS track showed it had deviated from its logged survey route and had stopped at a position that, when cross-referenced against the Baltic Sea infrastructure database that the P-8A carried as part of its standard mission package, placed it within 340 meters of the Gotland Fiber Cable System's tracked course, 340 meters from a NATO-critical cable. Stationary. Equipment deployed over the stern. The P-8A's mission commander transmitted the contact report to the NATO Maritime Command at Northwood at 11:20:11 p.m. and simultaneously queried the Baltic Cable Protection Intelligence database, a system established after the 2022 incidents that maintained real-time cross-referencing between vessel AIS tracks and cable infrastructure positions. The database responded with a high concern classification at 11:20:19 p.m., 8 seconds. The classification flagged the Vavilov's registered name against a secondary watch list of vessels with GRU infrastructure operation associations. The contact report and classification reached NATO Maritime Command's duty commander at 11:20:31 p.m. He activated the Cable Protection Response Protocol at 11:20:44 p.m., 13 seconds after receiving the report. The protocol had been established 18 months earlier following a NATO maritime infrastructure security review. It had never been activated. The protocol's first action was a legal assessment query, transmitted simultaneously to the NATO Legal Affairs Office and to the standing Maritime Interdiction Legal Authority maintained at Markham for exactly this class of scenario. The query asked, under current international law and NATO's standing rules of engagement, what authority exists to board, detain, or redirect a flagged civilian vessel in international waters suspected of conducting cable infrastructure interference? The legal assessment response came back at 11:22:17 p.m., 93 seconds after the query. It was brief and precise. Under the 1884 Cable Convention, a naval vessel could approach and inspect a vessel suspected of cable interference. boarding required flag state consent or a nexus to a crime against the boarding state's own infrastructure. Detention without flag state consent was legally unsupportable in international waters, absent evidence of an ongoing crime. The ROV currently in the water was not yet in contact with the cable. No crime had been committed. The legal basis for physical interdiction did not yet exist. What did exist was a 60-minute window. The P-8A's assessment of the ROV's deployment speed and the cable's depth profile at the Vavilov's position produced an operational estimate. At the ROV's observed descent rate and the cable's depth of approximately 90 meters at this location, the ROV would reach cable depth in approximately 17 minutes. The time required for a manipulator arm to physically sever a cable of the Gotland system's construction, a calculation drawn from the technical specifications in the infrastructure database, was approximately 8 to 14 minutes of contact. The total timeline from ROV deployment to cable severance, 25 to 31 minutes. 4 cuts required. Sequential operations. Total timeline to complete all 4 cuts, approximately 90 to 120 minutes, assuming the ROV was repositioned between cuts. The first cut could be prevented. The question was how. NATO had 3 assets within response range of the Vavilov's position. The closest was HNOMS Helga Ingstad, a Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen-class frigate operating 94 kilometers northeast on a Baltic patrol transit. At 30 knots, 94 kilometers was 108 minutes away. Too far. The second asset was a Swedish Navy Gotland-class submarine operating in its home waters northeast of Gotland, an asset that NATO had access to under Sweden's accession protocols. But that required Swedish National Command Authority authorization for any operational tasking. The Swedish duty officer at Berga Naval Base was notified at 11:21:14 p.m., 43 seconds after Marcom activated the protocol. The authorization process for a submarine intercept tasking was estimated at 22 to 35 minutes. The submarine, once tasked, could be at the Vavilov's position in approximately 40 minutes. Marginal. The third asset was the P-8A itself. Airborne, overhead with no physical interdiction capability but with sensors, communications, and the ability to make the Vavilov's crew aware that they were being observed. At 11:21:09 p.m., Marcom directed the P-8A to descend to 1,500 feet and establish an overwatch orbit directly over the Vavilov, with all lights active and transponder broadcasting on the maritime distress frequency. Observation without physical intervention. The crew of the Vavilov would know they were being watched. The ROV was already in the water. At 11:22:55 p.m., the United States 6th Fleet duty officer at Naples received the Marcom contact report through the NATO communication network. 6th Fleet had 2 assets within potentially useful range. USS Donald Cook, a forward-deployed Arleigh Burke-class destroyer out of Rota, Spain, was transiting the Kattegat Strait 340 kilometers to the southwest, roughly 6 hours away at maximum speed. Not useful. The second asset was an MH-60R helicopter detachment embarked on the Dutch frigate HNLMS De Ruyter, currently in Gdynia harbor for a routine port visit. De Ruyter was 280 kilometers away. The helicopter could be airborne in 8 minutes and at the Vavilov's position in 41 minutes. 41 minutes. The first cut was estimated at 25 to 31 minutes from the ROV deployment at 11:19 p.m. That placed the first cable severance at between 11:44 and 11:50 p.m. The helicopter would arrive at approximately 12:03 a.m., 12 to 19 minutes after the first cut. The race was between the ROV's descent and the Swedish submarine's authorization timeline. At 11:24:02 p.m., the Swedish National Command Authority watch officer at the Armed Forces Operations Center in Enköping authorized submarine tasking, 11 minutes and 11 seconds after the protocol activation. The Gotland-class submarine's commanding officer received tasking at 11:24:19 p.m. and brought his vessel to maximum speed on an intercept heading. Estimated time to position, 38 minutes. The first cut was still estimated at 25 to 31 minutes from deployment. The submarine would arrive 7 to 13 minutes after the first cut. Marcom's duty commander made the decision at 11:25:41 p.m. that shifted the response from reactive to active. The P-8A overhead had a payload that the response protocol's legal assessment had not addressed. An Mk-54 lightweight torpedo, carried as standard ordnance for the anti-submarine mission. The Vavilov was a surface vessel, not a submarine. The Mk-54 was not an appropriate response to a surface vessel conducting cable interference. But the P-8A also carried sonobuoys, passive acoustic sensors that, once deployed in the water around the Vavilov, would provide precise acoustic positioning of the ROV and generate a real-time track of its depth and position that could be transmitted to the Swedish submarine as it approached. Not a weapon. A sensor network that would hand the submarine a firing solution on the ROV the moment it established legal basis for action. 6 sonobuoys deployed from the P-8A at 11:26:33 p.m. in a pattern around the Vavilov. The acoustic picture of the ROV's descent resolved within 90 seconds. The P-8A transmitted the ROV track to the Swedish submarine at 11:28:07 p.m. The submarine now had real-time ROV positioning. It did not yet have authority to act on it. The legal basis for physical action materialized at 11:41:17 p.m. The ROV made contact with the Gotland Fiber Cable at 11:39:54 p.m. Earlier than estimated, the cable's depth at this specific position shallower than the database's general depth profile had indicated. The P-8A's acoustic sensors registered the contact as a change in the ROV's movement signature consistent with it engaging a fixed object. The Swedish Armed Forces duty officer in Stockholm transmitted a classification. Cable contact confirmed, infrastructure interference in progress. Swedish critical national infrastructure was being targeted. Under Swedish law and the NATO agreement's Article 5 infrastructure protection provisions, Sweden had legal authority to act against the vessel conducting the interference. The authorization to engage the ROV reached the Gotland-class submarine at 11:41:44 p.m., 27 seconds after the infrastructure interference classification. The submarine fired a MU90 impact torpedo at 11:42:09 p.m., guided by the sonobuoy network's ROV track. The MU90 was set to the ROV's depth and acoustic profile. It impacted the ROV at 11:42:31 p.m. The ROV was rendered non-functional. The cable had not been severed. The manipulator arm had been in contact with the cable exterior for approximately 1 minute and 40 seconds. Post-incident analysis of the cable would find surface scoring on the outer protective sheath consistent with initial cutting tool contact. No fiber optic bundles had been reached. The cable's signal integrity was unaffected. The Vavilov's crew recovered the ROV's tether at 11:43:17 p.m. and received confirmation at 11:43:51 p.m. that the ROV was non-functional. At 11:44:03 p.m., the vessel restarted its engines and began moving northwest at 12 knots. HNOMS Helga Ingstad, which had been proceeding at maximum speed since the protocol activation, established radar contact at 11:44:17 p.m. and broadcast a maritime warning ordering the Vavilov to heave to for inspection. The Vavilov did not comply. It continued at 12 knots toward the Swedish territorial water boundary, which it entered at 12:07 a.m. Once inside Swedish territorial waters, the vessel was subject to Swedish maritime jurisdiction. The Swedish Coast Guard cutter KBV-002 intercepted and boarded the Vavilov at 12:19 a.m. The vessel's crew offered no resistance. The ROV system, The manipulator tooling and the acoustic positioning equipment were photographed and inventoried. The 3 GRU technicians were detained pending legal review. All 3 held Russian diplomatic passports, which the Swedish Coast Guard noted in its boarding report, and which would generate 6 weeks of diplomatic processing before their status was resolved. Total timeline from P-8A contact detection to ROV neutralization: 23 minutes 24 seconds. Cable contact time before ROV was neutralized, approximately 1 minute 40 seconds. Cable damage: surface scoring only, no signal disruption. Swedish authorization timeline: 11 minutes 11 seconds. P-8A sonobuoy deployment to ROV track solution: 90 seconds. MU90 torpedo time from launch to impact: 22 seconds. Gotland Fiber Cable System status: fully operational. Military data traffic disruption: 0. Assets committed: 1 P-8A, 1 Swedish Gotland-class submarine, 1 Dutch MH-60R helicopter in transit that arrived at the scene at 12:04 a.m. after the engagement was complete. U.S. personnel directly involved in ROV neutralization: 0. The sonobuoy network that provided the firing solution was U.S. equipment operated from a U.S. aircraft. The torpedo was Swedish. The authorization was Swedish. The legal assessment that identified the precise threshold for action was NATO. The infrastructure database that flagged the cable proximity was a post-2022 capability that had not existed the last time a vessel of this type had operated in the Baltic. The incident was formally classified by NATO as a GRU maritime infrastructure interference operation, interrupted before completion, with 3 personnel detained pending diplomatic resolution. Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement at 9 a.m. the following morning describing the Vavilov as a legally operating civilian research vessel that had been subjected to unprovoked naval aggression by Swedish forces in international waters. The statement did not address the ROV, the GRU technicians, or the diplomatic passports. It was the statement that the GRU's planners had known would be issued before the operation began. It was also the statement that no one in the relevant capitals assigned significant weight to, because the P-8A's acoustic data, the sonobuoy tracks, and the boarding inventory had been compiled into a 17-page dossier that was transmitted to every NATO member's intelligence service at 3 a.m. The dossier was classified. Its conclusions were not difficult to summarize. If the first cut had succeeded, if the ROV had severed the Gotland fiber cable before the MU90 reached it, the response architecture would have shifted immediately. The submarine's authority to engage the ROV would have existed from the moment of severance. The Vavilov would have faced a naval boarding under the Swedish territorial waters jurisdiction that it entered at 12:07 a.m. The cable would have been down for between 3 and 6 weeks pending repair ship deployment. The 34% of northeastern flank military data traffic it carried would have shifted to satellite backup links running at a fraction of the fiber's capacity. The impact on the Baltic air policing radar architecture's real-time sensor fusion would have been significant, but not debilitating. The system had been designed with cable loss contingency protocols following the 2022 North Sea incidents. The military impact was manageable. The strategic message the GRU was attempting to deliver, that the eastern flank's communication infrastructure was reachable at will at any time, would have been delivered clearly. The response that preserved the cable also preserved the message's non-delivery. Those 23 minutes had not just protected fiber optic bundles. They had prevented a strategic communication. The 1884 Cable Convention had been written in a world of telegraph infrastructure and sailing vessels. The legal framework it created had not been substantially updated in 140 years. The response protocol that had identified the precise legal threshold, cable contact, infrastructure interference confirmed, Swedish critical infrastructure targeted, and held action within that threshold until the threshold was crossed, had been written 18 months earlier, had been tested in tabletop exercises twice, and had been updated 6 weeks before the Vavilov departed Kaliningrad based on a legal analysis that had correctly predicted the scenario that materialized on the night of the operation. The 23-minute window had closed in 23 minutes. The margin had been 1 minute and 40 seconds of cable contact time before the ROV was rendered inoperational. The infrastructure was intact. The precedent had been set. The legal framework had been used rather than abandoned, and the Baltic Sea's cable infrastructure was still operational at 12:19 a.m. when the Swedish Coast Guard boarded the Vavilov and found 3 men with diplomatic passports standing quietly in the vessel's operations room, next to a manipulator arm that was no longer attached to anything functional.